Hello everyone, my name is Lauren Boutz. My partner is Jordan Larson. Our presentation is on psychological first aid and mental health disaster response. The discussion questions for the week are: what is the relationship of place, social capital, and identity to mental health? And what strategies are used to restore individuals who have experienced disaster to health? An introduction to psychological first aid. Psychological first aid, or PFA, is an evidence-informed approach to help people in the immediate aftermath of disasters or terrorism. The timeline for psychological first aid: it had its origins in the 1940s, post-World War II. They started studying war-related trauma. In the 1970s, PFA began to take shape as a structured approach, particularly in the context of disaster mental health. Key milestones in its development include its adoption and promotion by major organizations like the American Red Cross and World Health Organization. In the early 2000s, there was a significant evolution in PFA, especially following major disasters like 9/11, Asian tsunami in 2004, and Hurricane Katrina. These events highlighted the necessity for immediate psychological support in disaster scenarios. In 2006, the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder developed codified guidelines for PFA. So what is psychological first aid? PFA is a humane, supportive response to individuals suffering in the immediate aftermath of a disaster or crisis. PFA aims to reduce initial distress, foster short-term functioning, and facilitate access to continued support if necessary. PFA can be used by many different organizations and responders. Some of those include mental health professionals, emergency responders, community volunteers. It's used in organizations like the Red Cross, FEMA, WHO, and various non-governmental organizations. How is it used? It's applied in diverse settings: natural disasters, terrorist attacks, mass violence, and other traumatic events. The key components include listening without pressuring, comforting, helping people connect to information and services, and ensuring physical and emotional safety. Impact of disasters on mental health. Types of disasters include natural disasters such as hurricanes, wildfires, and human-made, non-intentional, and intentional disasters. Some non-intentional are Chernobyl, 2023 Ohio train derailment, and intentional such as mass shootings and 9/11. The immediate effects of disasters on mental health include shock, denial, acute stress. The long-term effects include PTSD, depression, and anxiety. The risk and protective factors of disasters on mental health. Risk factors: individual are previous trauma, mental illness or disability, direct exposure to disaster, and vulnerable populations. Family includes loss or separation and loss of place. Community: extent of disaster, infrastructure damage, isolation, displacement, limited resources. The protective factors include, for the individual, are resilience, coping skills, place attachment. Family has social support, emotional and practical help, pre-existing relationships. On the community level, access to mental health services and effective disaster response plans.
This is Jordan Larson, and so for vulnerable groups in disasters, there's a couple different populations you'll want to consider. First, there's children, and so they're going to need age-appropriate support, whether that be a baby, someone who's a little bit older, but also take in consideration what's their relationship with their family if they have a family. For the elderly, they're going to probably need some assistance with the different medical and emotional needs. So, what kind of medications are they taking? Do they have any other like physical limitations, things of that nature? There's also people with disabilities who would be at risk due to their disability. They may have certain accessibility or care challenges, and that could not only be accessing them, but also putting them in access with the different social supports or aid that might be in place. And then there's also the socioeconomically disadvantaged in a particular disaster area. There may be limited resources that kind of support the recovery, as well as just being in a more rural area or something like that. After a disaster, you never know where that might actually be. So taking consideration the different resources that are available and what needs there may be. In the study of disaster recovery as well as psychological first aid, there's a multitude of convergence and divergence. First, with convergence, there was a really big significance as far as social capital goes. And so, like the different assets and resources that are in not only a location and community, but also that individuals have, that was found to be really key for resilience. There was also a really big emphasis on reorientation, whether that be at a community level, interpersonal level, or individual level. Like in the Cox paper, they really highlighted how some of like the re-greening efforts and kind of just the different, like developing that identity and reorienting to what that is. Similarly with psychological first aid, some of that when you first come in contact with someone, you're trying to kind of reorient them to their surroundings, who they are, different things like that. And then also there was a big alignment with trauma-informed care. So understanding that someone went through a really traumatic event, and as you're interacting with them, having that at the forefront of your mind. As far as divergence went, um, some of the recovery really emphasized returning to the status quo. So when it comes to PFA, they're trying to kind of address those immediate needs and try to kind of like move through or get to a certain point as quickly as possible. In the Cox paper, it was not found to necessarily be valuable, and that actually created some conflict between different parties, whether you're at kind of like the government level or, been a long time local, what have you. Um, Additionally, kind of with PFA, it's very individually focused, which has a kind of some like immediate gains. But again, in the Cox paper, they really emphasized how important the community's response was to disaster recovery, because each person's recovery process is going to be different. But the overall community and kind of like what that looks like from a more holistic view was really stressed in the Cox paper, which tends to kind of conflict a little bit with PFA. And then last is the short and long-term impacts. PFA really emphasizes kind of that short-term, immediate first aid. Like let's, reorient, let's kind of get someone kind of a little bit more grounded, let's address some of the immediate needs. However, the long-term impacts of a disaster cannot really be addressed by PFA. And so kind of there was a difference in kind of the approaches there for disaster recovery. And challenges that go into disaster recovery. Some key recommendations for promoting health outcomes would, one of the most important ones was effective reorientation. So really helping people make sense of the different kinds of losses, changes that have been associated with the disaster. There was also a big emphasis in the text about identity, not only for the community, but the individual, and kind of making sense of either their past or new identity. It's also recommended to combine the immediate psychological first aid with long-term psychological supports. So that could look like addressing the immediate symptoms after a disaster, but then putting them in touch with something like social services, food banks, or therapists. Building resilience was another thing that was stressed within the text, and so that includes not only after but prior. So the different social capital that people have or can invest in can really help in building that resilience as well as maintaining that identity, but also afterwards helping them develop things like coping skills, going to therapy, things like that can also assist in the resilience process. You also want to incorporate a holistic approach to disaster recovery. In the Cox paper, they had highlighted how there was an economic focus for the recovery process, but when it comes to a natural disaster or any disaster for that matter, looking at like the entire picture at the individual, interpersonal, and community level to really understand what are the different changes or what are the different issues that occur in each of those places. And so looking at the full scale of the disaster and not just it in terms of finances. Also, some policy development that addresses mental health and disaster management would be really important. This would be something that ideally would be prior to a disaster, but afterwards, having different policies that really address some of those mental health needs that would occur in the event of a disaster. And then last, community support campaigns were something that were shown to be successful within with the All Right initiative or a campaign where basically they introduced well-being tips to the different communities after a disaster. And that really seemed to help people not only put them in touch with supports, but kind of develop that community and kind of maintain that sense of identity. So as far as challenges go, there are some ethical considerations. So as far as like confidentiality and dignity, regardless of the disaster that someone has just gone through, there can be a lot of sensitive topics and things to consider. So going into a disaster zone or something like that, you want to make sure that you maintain the dignity and the confidentiality of something because they may not be ready for things like therapy or social supports because they're still processing what happened to them. Cultural competence is a really important thing to take into consideration, whether that be like languages, local culture, what have you. So that can be something that could be challenging for someone who isn't as familiar with the area. And then toxic positivity could come as a result of this kind of thing. And that kind of leans into some of those divergences where it's kind of like, let's get over this, let's move past this, you're going to be okay, when someone may not be ready for that. Logistical challenges, accessing the affected areas, that could be really difficult. After a natural disaster, there may be roads that are, no longer functional. There may be dangerous like power lines, different things like that. So accessing them could be difficult. And then coordinating the different resources. Sometimes there can be a big influx of aid or resources, and so that can kind of create a too many cooks in the kitchen situation. So coordinating resources and having those leaders might be recommended for that, but is something that could definitely present challenges. And then last, there would be the security concerns in the conflict zones themselves. So similarly, like, is it safe? Like, is there, certain hazards that are still present, what have you? So when it comes to actually accessing the area, people who are providing PFA or what have you are definitely going to want to consider that. Moving forward, it's going to be really important to integrate PFA into the initial disaster recovery. Cultural competency training is something that's also proven to be really helpful. That's some of the things that PFA itself really emphasizes. And so having ongoing and relevant cultural competency training would be really important for anyone who's going to provide PFA. That holistic approach to recovery. And so just not looking at the individual, but the community as a whole and the disaster process from kind of beginning and then even after. And then research and refinement of the PFA models. It's been around since about 2006. And so continue to research and refine the model to kind of make further improvements will be really important. And then policy development to enhance and better fund disaster prevention will also be helpful to kind of integrate it more into disaster recovery. As was previously mentioned, this came as a result of like 9/11, Hurricane Katrina. And so having policies that help really solidify the approaches and having that more consistent approach in the event of disasters will be helpful not only for the policy development, but also the research. Last slide we have is all of our references. Thank you everyone for listening.